Okie dokie. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We are going to hear from Fiona Gale about recent conservation work and research into Ruthin Castle in North Wales. So this should be a very interesting talk about a site which definitely could do with the attention. It's a really interesting place with some interesting personalities as well. So that's far too much from me. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening. Yes, I'm going to talk tonight about Ruthin Castle, which is in northeast Wales. It's a ruinous castle. What I intend to do is to take us through a little bit of where it is, the protection of it, what has happened to it up to now, and a little bit about where we hope to be going. My role at Ruthin Castle is chair of a conservation trust, but more about that in a moment. And this lovely reconstruction is a reconstruction that was done by Chris Jones-Jenkins with input and advice from Will Davis and Sian Rees, who were using all the available information that there is, which, as you will, as I go through, you'll realize there's very little apart from the actual structure to base that on. And hopefully this, there we go. That is what it looks like today. Now, hopefully, as I move my mouse, you can see that. The remains today are the curtain wall here with a postern gate just here, central ditch, lower ward, upper ward, curtain wall round here, turret, curtain wall, turret, main gateway here, curtain wall round here. But as you can see, there's a great big house in the middle of it, and more about that too in a while. And there are various phases to that. This structure, though, the return of the curtain wall would have come through here. Whether it is preserved within that structure or not, I don't know. But the moated area is in this part. So the moat carries on around here and an outer bailey here. The site, not surprisingly, is a scheduled ancient monument. That's this red line here. The building, which is etched in red here, that is a listed structure, listed grade 2 star. It is also an historic park and garden, which is this line here. So the castle is just here. I am hoping that you can see this mouse. If anyone can't see it, do nod or let me know. So this is the castle, but this is its historic parkland. That is dating back to the Victorian mansion, which I'll talk about more, and its setting in the areas around. It's also a conservation area within the town. So there are lots of protections, but from an owner's point of view, and it is all completely privately owned, lots of constraints as well. So the castle itself, Ruthin Castle, is one of the castles built as part of Edward I's campaign into Wales. Initially in 1277, David ap Griffith was given the area, Dyffryn Clwyd, Vale of Clwyd, and he was charged with building a castle at Ruthin. We don't quite know whether what we're looking at today has any remains of his work or some remains, but he rose up, as I'm sure you all know, he rose up against Edward 5 years later, and the area Dyffryn Clwyd and the site of the castle went back to the crown and then was granted to Reginald de Grey, who was charged with building the castle. And we think that much of the remains today in this little plan, which will keep popping up on many of the screens, this little plan here shows what is now remaining of the castle. But so most of that, we think, relates to the time of Reginald de Grey, so starting from 1282, and then his successors. And they influenced the town a great deal. A chapel was founded in the town. The parish church is on the outskirts. A chapel was founded within the town, which by the time of Reginald de Grey's son being in control, became a collegiate church with monks attached to it. Not 100 years and bit after it was established, Owain Glyndŵr attacks Ruthin and the castle, doesn't manage to take Ruthin Castle, but that is the beginning of the Glyndŵr uprising in Wales, which at its heart had a personal argument between the de Greys and Glyndŵr. So the castle wasn't taken by Glyndŵr, but it wasn't exactly maintained. By 1632, a survey for Charles I described it as ruined, apart from the main gatehouse. And at that stage, it was sold to Thomas Middleton, the Middletons of Chirk Castle. The castle was refortified. We don't quite know to what extent, but it was held by the Royalists in the Civil War, during the Civil War period, and suffered a lengthy siege, but then the site did fall to the parliamentarians, and subsequently the medieval castle was slighted, damaged deliberately to ensure that you couldn't fortify it again. And the site, one presumes, became a quarry within the town, but handily, nicely finished stonework that you could then incorporate into further building within the town. It's still owned by the Middletons at this stage, and in the early 1800s, a smallish limestone mansion house was built by Harriet Middleton. She died without she had no children, she hadn't married, and so the estate passed to her nephew, who then extended the mansion house and built what you can see here, this large structure here, which is built of red sandstone, and designed by John Clutton. And so that, from the mid 1850s, that's pretty much what we see today. That is this doorway here. If you've ever visited Ruthin Castle for the hotel, which is what most people now think of Ruthin Castle as, that is where you go in. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's very little documentary evidence for Ruthin Castle. There is this very sketchy but very useful plan and bird's eye view undertaken by Randall Holm in the very early 17th century, early 1600s. And whilst it's not 100% accurate, it does describe pretty much what is still on the ground, but more importantly, it gives an indication of some of the interior buildings. So we've got the gatehouse here, which is going down to the modern day plan, this area here. You come round to a corner turret, the northeast tower, northwest tower, the curtain wall here, and interestingly, a gallery shown there, or a corridor shown with a great hall area here. F is a chapel, and this area here, the number I can't quite read, is kitchen area. Then we've got a central ditch between the two wards of the castle, a deep rock cut ditch separating the two halves of the castle, and the postern gate is here, that's still standing, we'll look at that shortly, and then a corner turret here returning through here. Now the building today sits pretty much on top of this part, so this has disappeared. But this little bird's eye view is very interesting, as it shows this chapel here with its massive turret. Now, the bird's eye view is extending that view of it. And we think there's some sort of apsidal end here, which may be reflected in part of the mansion building. But the main gatehouse here and the postern gate in this area, apart from one very, very tiny illustration in a painting that sits in Chirk Castle, there's very little evidence apart from this of what Ruthin Castle looked like. The next information we get is when it is ruinous. This is 1740s, a buck print of Ruthin Castle and the town over here, church here, the town here. This is the west curtain wall with the postern gate and the decorative stonework at the top here, which would have behind had the mechanism for a portcullis. You can see the remains of that inside the masonry still today, but in a very ruinous state, as you can see, because this is what, just under 100 years after the Civil War, when it had been deliberately damaged. So it remains in this ruinous state for a couple of 100 years. This map over here, the map is actually dated 1826, and the mansion house, the first part of it, was constructed 1821 to 25, but the map doesn't show that mansion house on it. It's showing the castle again, pretty much as the Randall Holm plan, the gateway here, turrets and the curtain wall. Nothing shown in the interior area, the bailey here, but open in this area. There is currently today a footpath that comes down here, which is, you can see, but now that has a massive stone wall to keep you out of the castle grounds, because when the house was built, privacy was what was wanted. Also, this road coming through here, which is a road from the south, was diverted when this mansion house was constructed. So it's a very sketchy evidence for the castle. So the mansion house remained in the same family, effectively the heirs to the Middletons, who were the Cornwallis West family, until the 1920s. And at that stage, it was sold and became Duff House Private Hospital. The Duff House Hospital was in Scotland, in Banff. And this was a second, an outlier of it. And it was the sort of hospital, I always describe it rather as the priory might be now, that people will go to. It wasn't for any internal illnesses. It's described as being for somewhere people went when it wasn't quite sure what was wrong with them. So I suspect it was drug addiction, alcoholism, that sort of thing. It was very quiet, very private, out of the way, and a beautiful setting. Having said that, people like Lawrence Olivier and Omar Sharif were here. Local people had their photographs and etc. And I suspect these little sort of hut things were for people, you know, convalescing or whatever at the hospital. And so this is the mansion house, but you can see there's additions that have been added onto it. So the hospital added on wings to the main house, which again are on top of the medieval castle. Interestingly, when this mansion house is built, that is when the gardens that you look at and see today, which are the subject of the Historic Park and Garden registration, those gardens leveled out the interior of the castle, raising up the layers and levels within it, in some places by as much as 3 meters, hiding a lot of the evidence of the castle. So this is a plan of the hospital. I get my mouse, here we go. That is the mansion house, and this here. These are additions added onto the main house by the hospital in the 1920s and 30s. And here, the curtain walls of the castle with the main gatehouse here. So it remained a hospital with these, some of the illustrations from inside with all sorts of various machines and things within them. Not sure what they did, but it remained a hospital till the 1960s, when then it was sold and became a hotel. And that is what it is today, marketed as Ruthin Castle Hotel. And many visitors to the town, and even people who live in the town, this is what Ruthin Castle is. It's not they're not thinking of the medieval ruins, the remains of the castle related to Edward I. They're seeing this building here. In fact, just this week, I talked to somebody locally who said, of course, Ruthin Castle is a much later folly, isn't it? But of course it isn't. But you could be forgiven for thinking that, the way it is marketed. And equally, these are interior and exterior images of the castle, the mansion house, which is, the castle dates back to the legend of King Arthur, with notable owners including King Edward I, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Well, in one sense, yes, those owners were indeed owners, not so sure about the legend of Arthur, but it's a romantic image that is being sold here at Ruthin Castle. The medieval remains very much are taking a back seat. So building on that, of all the castles linked to Edward I's campaign into Wales, it's perhaps in the worst condition. It is in a parlour state. Will Davis, in a statement of significance that he has been putting together for the castle, says it stands out as the only one in the group to have been hardly had any antiquarian description, very little academic study, and even less conservation to the actual structure. That's partly because for the mansion house developed in the 1850s, picturesque gardens were what you wanted. Having crumbling ruins in the garden was exactly what you wanted. So covering all those ruins in and planting ivy amongst them, rebuilding other bits of medieval masonry, but rebuilding it within the garden was exactly what you wanted. Maintaining it in a sound condition wasn't of key importance. And so the gardens developed around the house. And here, this area, these pictures are of what's called the Italian garden, and that dates to the 1850s. And about, in places, 3 meters of material built up in order to ensure a level within those garden areas, but also to allow for complicated drainage and water systems to be hidden. And that has meant that there are now what appear to be underground areas within the medieval remains, but that in fact most probably originally were not underground. And that there's just been a lack of maintenance to the medieval castle. The inappropriate use of cement particularly, but other materials, has meant that deterioration has speeded up. And it's a medieval arch. It was re-erected, I think, in the Victorian period as a garden feature. Just to the left of it over here is a spiral stair that would have been going up to an upper level of a turret. But this, you can see here, this is cement that has obviously at some stage been used to repoint what would have been a stone inside there. No sign of a stone now. The cement and then that inappropriate material that is too hard means that the very soft red sandstone of which much of the castle is constructed just crumbles away. As you can see from the sandstone in this arch, there are places where it's just gone back to sand. So this is effectively what is there today. The hotel buildings are shown here, but what we're looking at in shaded in grey are the remains of the medieval castle. So we've got, there we go. We've got curtain wall here. There was a turret here, and that is shown on the Randall picture as a little plan. The main great gatehouse, of which there are a basement level. Well, this side of the gatehouse purely remains at basement level. This one we'll talk about further shortly, and had rebuilt areas in Victorian period, but underground there are basement levels that are medieval remains. We've got a Victorian sort of staircase and gateway that links the two originally. Presumably the two sides of each of the gatehouse were joined at upper levels. Then we've got curtain wall coming around here, northeast tower, curtain wall, northwest tower, all that surviving, albeit in a poor state, and some of this curtain wall, which again I'll show you more closely shortly, had a lot of rebuilding from ground level up. If you're standing in the inside here, you're much higher than you are out here, and the curtain wall here, a lot of that has been rebuilt, but if you're standing on the outside, the lower levels of it haven't. We've got a site of a great hall and that gallery, site of the kitchen, the tower, Sallyport here, postern gate coming in to this central ditch, and a turret surviving here. But as you can see, the hotel building sits right on top of it and has destroyed parts of it, and the garden area here, that Italian garden is here where it says upper ward, that too has covered up a lot of the remains. So my involvement started, my first involvement with Ruthin Castle. I used to work as county archaeologist in the area, and 25 years ago I think it was, I had to visit the site because there'd been a small collapse. This is the postern gate, and the collapse was just adjacent to it here. So I visited with the enforcement officer for the county council, because I was working for the county council. Nothing had been done about this collapse. A section of the top of the curtain wall was in a heap at the bottom, and the idea was to try and encourage the owners to do some sympathetic repairs. Sadly, that didn't work, but so 25 years ago was the first time I visited this site, along with some of the county councillors who all tutted and said, oh gosh, this is terrible. But very little has happened as far as repair work. In 2016, the previous owner of the site, bearing in mind it is a hotel, privately owned, set up a community enterprise company with the aim of bringing about the conservation of the medieval remains. It was set up as a community enterprise company rather than as a charity, because at that stage it was felt a community enterprise company can trade. So if we as a trust needed to try and generate income by doing certain things or whatever, we could do that. But the constraints and the controls are very, very similar to a charity. It was registered, Ruthin Castle Conservation Trust, and trustees were appointed, and newspaper pleas out there to seek funding. However, the picture that the newspaper uses is the Victorian gatehouse into the castle, not the medieval castle. Obviously, with newspapers, you haven't got that much control of what they choose to print. But I think that reinforces that most people think of it as think of the castle as the Victorian building. So the primary aim of the trust, of which I became chair just under 2 years ago, when there was a change of ownership of the hotel, primary aim is to halt the deterioration of the medieval masonry. We'll look more closely at that in a minute to give you an idea of the condition of it, and to undertake repairs and reconsolidation so that people can appreciate and understand what is here. At the moment, people wander about, but there's nothing but to tell them about it, really. And equally, they don't appreciate, I think, that it is medieval masonry, a lot of what they're seeing. And as I say, the trust was set up by the previous owners of the freehold of the site. And there are 8 trustees currently. I think we can have up to a total of 10. 2 of those trustees are representatives of the private owner, the hotel, so that they know what's going on and they are involved, and they need to support the trust. If they didn't, there's no point having it. There'd be no point being at loggerheads with them. So there are 2 trustees who represent the hotel, but equally, with it only being 2, they can't have a majority to do things that would be particularly for the benefit of the hotel rather than for the medieval monument. There's local town council representatives, historians from the local area, an ex-caddo inspector of ancient monuments, local historians, castle experts, conservation experts. So we're a fairly we're a fairly broad group from both the local area and from further afield. And so far, work fairly successfully together, I think. So the trust was set up 5 years ago. And in that time, quite a bit has been achieved. Initially, there was a major programme of work funded directly by CADU. So CADU paid the people doing the work directly. It wasn't a grant that came to either the trust or the hotel. It was 100% funding by CADU direct, which was fantastic, but it was to do emergency repairs. We'll look at some of those more closely in a moment. And some of it basically, it was trying to hold bits in place to prevent them falling off basework and landing in the heap at the bottom of a wall or whatever, till such time as more permanent repairs can take place. We've got an interpretive plan, an idea of the sort of things we'd want to tell people about the site. The feasibility study, which was looking more at some of the commercial aspects of it, which are less useful for us now, I think, as a trust, but there are still some very useful elements within there. And in the last 18 months, the COVID situation, we've actually been quite successful in seeking some funding there. We've had time to give us time to get our governance in good shape and coaching to help us write business plans, stuff like that. And we applied for cultural recovery funding, which was government funding, COVID related. And we've got a conservation architect who is readdressing the conservation management plan, looking at the whole site, and that there'll be a long list of issues that need to be addressed. So the CADU direct funding went to some survey work. There was initial stripping of vegetation off the whole of the west curtain wall and turrets. This is the northeast tower. All of this was completely covered in ivy. When that vegetation strip was done, and in a while I'll show you that it was carried out by a very specialist company, dangling, that makes it sound very dangerous, dangling down on ropes. It was obviously very safely done, but they were basically abseiling down the wall and removing the vegetation as they went. But the decision was taken, we wouldn't take out the roots of all this vegetation, and some of them, there were yew trees and things that look quite small, but actually their roots are enormous, and they must have been growing out of this wall for 100 years or so. But by leaving the roots in, and yes, that means the vegetation has come back, but had we taken those roots out, I think we'd have had an even worse problem to deal with, because well, as you'll see, we haven't been able to do the more permanent works yet, but these temporary works were intended to be. So this northeast turret was stripped of vegetation, and what has happened to it, it's this one here in the modern plan, here in Randall Holmes plan from early 1600s. This turret is now encased in a very sturdy chicken wire, effectively. It's sturdier than chicken wire, but it's encased inside and outside with a wire mesh. The purpose of that, to keep it all together, to catch bits if they do fall out, but to also hold it together. The northwest tower, which is this one here and here on the Randall Holmes plan, this has a lot of the facework surviving on it, unlike the northeast tower, where much of the facework has long since disappeared. But there were patches, particularly where this red rectangle is, if you can see that. Well, I remember saying to somebody, oh, you could get your head in there. The gap between the facework and the core work behind, but obviously they should be right close together. And apparently architects do use that as a way to describe. They don't obviously put their heads in there, but what it means is there was a big gap. This facework clinging on by virtually nothing. And the emergency repairs in this area involved putting ratchet straps and planks around the turret. And here, this is the people, it was a company called Ibex who both stripped the masonry and also carried out this work, because again, to do the work, they needed to be hanging from the wall at certain times. So there are ratchet straps around the turret and then planks of wood, literally just stopping that facework moving any further, so to keep it in place. But if you look here in this image, which is when the planks were going in, there's 3. There's only 2 now. So this is 4 years later. These temporary repairs in places are coming to the end of their life, as they were designed. They were only designed to last about 5 years. But the conservation management plan is picking up that, yes, basically this repair work is still working, but these turrets are moving. Otherwise, the timber work would be in exactly the same state as it was when put in 2017. You can see the size of the tree roots that are growing out of the masonry. So as well, at the same time as the photogrammetric survey that was done of the faces of the walls as they were uncovered, an archaeologist, Tim Morgan, followed behind, sort of annotating those photogrammetric elevations, marking on the facework. So this is the northwest tower, sort of opened out, if you like, and the areas of facework marked. So that's this turret here. And we went this particular area, we went down the whole way in that manner, following up with the archaeological recording. So here we are inside the upper ward, the Italian garden now, and much of this curtain wall here was reconstructed at the time the Italian garden was set out. It's not wide at all. It's maybe 30, 40 centimeters at most, but it's sitting on top of the much more massive medieval curtain wall. And if you're outside, you can see that. So the areas here, it is much more massive than the outside. But these are highlighting areas where you can see through the stone. There's vast gaps in the mortar. Moving around the site, we come down to here, this gallery area, which is where we think there was a great hall, and it's certainly where Randall Holm in the early 1600s marks a hall, a large building within the castle. And interestingly, he does show a sort of corridor along here, which is now this. This is a view of that corridor. I would think 50, 60 years ago, this area, this narrow corridor, is now known as the Ladies' Walk. It's part of the gardens to perambulate around. Interestingly, this photograph is labelled the Old Armoury, which is quite an interesting idea of it. And these are the photogrammetric images of this narrow area in here, with highlighted areas where the facework is just sort of hanging there with nothing to support it, and where here it has disappeared completely. And yes, this corridor is now a Victorian construction predominantly, but it is replicating or holding within it, I'm not exactly sure, something that was certainly originally there in the early 1600s. And here, these are the external image of that wall. Those, if I go back to that previous, we've got these openings coming, there are openings out this way on the wall. So you can see out. If you were perambulating along this corridor, you look out to lovely views back towards the town. And here the annotated illustration showing the facework that remains. This, and I've got a photograph of it in a moment, all of this part is largely, we think, Victorian reconstruction. Certainly the appearance of it is. And this is this tower here, the West Tower, opened out again with the facework showing. But here, we're standing outside in the Outer Bailey now, looking up at that corridor here. And you can just see through these openings some bits of timber and here. And that's the propping that was done with this directly granted CADU money. But you can see here is the medieval facework. And this, a very rough and it's sort of limestone core work, it looks like, we think is most probably enhanced of the original masonry, but enhanced as a garden feature in the Victorian period. But this medieval facework. And here we're looking through at some of that propping. We've got this particular here, these are the openings looking out towards the view. This, you can see the angle that is, it wasn't going to last much longer. And here there's equally propping holding this up. This has withstood the test of time quite well, doesn't seem to have moved too much. But again, it's not designed as a permanent solution. Moving around the curtain wall, the West Curtain Wall, we come to the postern gate here. Massive hole in it here, presumably as a result of the slighting post-Civil War. And again, the recording of all the original medieval facework. So here we are on the Randall Holm plan. Here we are on the modern plan. And we are just through the postern gate here, you come into the central ditch of the castle. Moving around, we're now just inside that postern gate area, just here. An area of the castle where it's very difficult to pick out what is original medieval masonry, what is enhanced Victorian, what is completely new Victorian. And really we need to get to grips with that much more. But basically you can see this stonework is, and there's virtually no mortar holding it together. I pinched this picture of the bride perched on those stairs from the castle website. But if you look, she is standing on stairs that these stairs here, and this drawing marking up shows that is an area that is in desperate need of some repair work. It hasn't happened yet, but those stones are just hanging there by the skin of their teeth. So there was this direct funding from CADU which made an enormous difference, held some of the medieval masonry in place. We'd be in a much worse position now if that hadn't happened. But fundamentally, the medieval remains are still falling down. But also the Gothic mansion. This is the Victorian entrance to the castle, looking all quite nice, and that maybe about 1900, something like that, not that long, 40, 50 years after it was built. Very nice little oriel window here. But in January this year, half of that window ended up on the road, and now it's on the interior, and the castellations up here, well, you wouldn't, I don't walk near here because they're going to fall down one day, but so it's not just the medieval masonry that needs work. These are Victorian sandstone parapets that were built on top of the curtain wall, on top of the medieval curtain wall. But as you can see, these are, well, they're just falling apart. There's nothing there, nothing holding all this together. And these are areas where the hotel guests are perambulating around and enjoying the views, leaning over those balustrades. This, again, Victorian staircase that takes you down into the central ditch. Closed to visitors at the moment, not surprisingly, because you can see the vast holes within the stairs, but also this balustrade I think the ivy holds it together as much as mortar and stonework. Well, you can see through it. It's not something I'd be safe leaning on. There is, I don't know what the date of this wooden bridge is. I suspect early 1900s, maybe when it was a hospital site, I would think from the 1920s maybe. But this, where that bride was just here. This is the medieval curtain wall, postern gate just out of sight. But this is the medieval wall that is on one side of that central ditch. Had a hole punched through it when this bridge was constructed, very roughly punched through it. And this bridge, it too is now collapsing. No entry signs on it, but it joins the two wards of the medieval castle. Just yesterday, I visited the site to discover that that bridge is being repaired. So that will be quite interesting to see how that happens. Today, these oak posts are hanging in midair as they are too being replaced. But this, you can see, this is the curve is there because of the angle of the image. It's actually a straight wall. This is the medieval wall on one side of the central ditch. We are down in the central ditch of the medieval castle, with the mansion, which also straddles this central ditch up here. So what are we going to do now? I mean, there is still active and severe collapse. It depresses me every time I look at it, both the medieval castle, the garden features, the Victorian mansion. One particular area of concern now is this gatehouse, which is here, the southern tower of the gatehouse. The upper part of it was reconstructed in the Victorian period when the mansion house was built, when this house was built. But it sits directly on top of the medieval from undercroft to that area. This is the external face of that tower now. Well, this was about 2 months ago. These, yes, it's a Victorian structure, but it is directly linked with the lower levels of it. The sandstone jambs of this window are popping out. The castellations have all but gone. We've got acro props that have been there a good 20 or 30 years, holding bits of it up. Just a slightly different view of it. But this opening here, you're looking down. If we were actually there peering in, we would be looking into this medieval room. That is that window on the inside. This photograph was taken, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. When visiting this march, this whole jam part here is this heap of masonry here. So if that gets any worse, the collapse there gets worse, the upper levels will also come down. And this needs to be preserved. It needs to be looked after. It's one of the key medieval features of the site. This is in a similar area. What we've got here, this is a Victorian staircase leading up to a Victorian gateway that straddles the main gatehouse of the castle. But here, this locked gate is a medieval flight of stairs that's taking you to the lower levels of the gatehouse. And what we've got here, this piece of wall, is effectively what we have is the facework, and I'll show you the interior of it in a minute, is the facework with the rest of the wall that should be here missing. And this hole appeared. That has only been there maybe a year. But if we look at it, that hole is that. So we've got really nice facework here that is like this on the outside. It's just wafer thin, really. It's that one level layer of the masonry here. And you can see the amount of collapse of the material from the medieval structure down onto these stairs. And that little bit of light there is where you're going into the lower level of one side of the gatehouse, not the reconstructed Victorian side, but from that side you can get to that underground area of the medieval masonry. And here too you can just see this is just sand. The sandstone is literally going back to sand, and these just other views of that same structure. This another this entranceway here also takes you to those what are now underground layers, and a whole heap of masonry on the ground here that fell off relatively recently because there's very little vegetation here, so the pacework just is in a heap here. So in relation to that gatehouse, we are submitting, by the end of this month, I'm keeping my fingers crossed here, we will have submitted a grant application to CADU in order to address issues in that gatehouse. And the programme of work this year will be a complete vegetation clearance of that gatehouse, recording of all elevations and producing an accurate plan. So we don't have that sort of information of this part of the castle, and then reconsolidation and repair as necessary. And CADU have indicated that potentially we could have the same sort of amount of funding in a subsequent year to complete that repair work. This little illustration here is the extract from the painting at Chirk Castle that I mentioned right at the very beginning, which is thought to be Ruthin Castle. So this must be the postern gate down here with maybe the chapel in here. But we hope, if we're successful with this application to CADU, and we have had indications that we will be, that we can make a start on repairing that gatehouse. Now, obviously, there's a vast amount, much more of the medieval castle to repair. And the gatehouse is a tiny bit over here, and we've got all of the curtain, the west curtain wall here. So concurrently with applying to CADU for specific funding to address issues at that main gatehouse, we have been working, we have some mentoring, coaching help from an organisation through which we're beginning to develop a business plan. All these sort of documents you need if we are then going to talk to people like the National Heritage Lottery Fund. Twice in the last month I have met with the local MP because it's one of the areas that has a £20 million levelling up fund. And I'm hoping that we might get a little bit, just a proportion of £20 million would be nice, could go quite a long way to repairing Ruthin Castle and getting it into a state that people can visit, can understand. The hotel will benefit as well if they're not perched on top of collapsing masonry, but more importantly, the structure itself, hopefully, and I'm touching wood here, would have a much better and much more assured future. So that's what we hope will be happening. Maybe 10 years' time I can report that it has happened, but fingers crossed. And thank you very much indeed for listening.